London, 1882, when gaslight bled through the fog like pale judgment, and the Thames carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken oaths. Two houses bound themselves to a contract that neither love nor mercy had been invited to witness. The Ashbourne name was spoken in Parliament with careful respect, and in drawing rooms with careful fear. It was not a family. It was an inheritance of discipline carved into flesh. From it stood two brothers, Duke Edmund Ashbourne and Duke Alaric Ashbourne, men raised not by lullabies, but by expectations sharp enough to draw blood. Edmund, the elder, ruled his estate with measured silence, believing emotion to be a weakness that rot would follow. Alaric, younger by 3 years, carried an even colder reputation. He was said to observe before he judged, and when he judged, even mercy hesitated. That winter, both brothers were summoned not by choice, but by decree disguised as diplomacy. The crown, weary of fractured alliances among noble bloodlines, had pressed two households into an arranged union. Brides would be delivered, vows would be spoken, and the future would be sealed without the inconvenience of affection. Across the country, in a provincial estate where the walls seemed to remember every cry they had ever contained, the Whitmore family prepared their own offering. Lady Eleanor Whitmore and Lady Celeste Whitmore were sisters by birth, yet strangers in the way their home treated them. In that house, daughters were not raised, they were assessed. Eleanor, the elder, had learned early that silence was safer than honesty. Celeste, younger and sharper in mind than their father ever cared to notice, had learned that intelligence in a woman was considered a defect to be hidden. Their family spoke of the coming union as one speaks of clearing livestock before winter. There was no pride in it, only calculation. The Whitmores had decided the Ashbourne dukes expected ugliness, and so ugliness would be the currency offered. It was easier, they believed, to bind powerful men to disappointment than to risk them noticing worth. So lies were stitched carefully into reputation. Rumors were whispered into society. The Whitmore sisters were plain, awkward, forgettable. Not worth admiration, only obligation. It was a strategy dressed in cruelty, perfected by a family that had long ago mistaken control for love. On the morning of departure, the estate grounds were drowned in a pale, endless rain. The carriage waited like a judgment at the end of the gravel path. Servants moved quickly, not with sorrow, but relief. Even the air felt lighter, as if the house itself was exhaling two burdens it had never wanted. Eleanor stood first at the threshold. A white veil was placed over her head, not delicate lace meant for celebration, but heavy fabric meant for concealment. It fell across her face like a sealed verdict. She did not resist. Resistance, in her experience, only changed the shape of suffering, never its outcome. Celeste followed after, her own veil lowered with equal finality. Yet beneath that covering, her fingers trembled once, just once, before she curled them into stillness. No one noticed. No one in that house ever noticed anything that did not serve them. Their father did not come to see them off. Their mother, long emptied of warmth by years of obedience to a cruel marriage, remained behind in a chamber where silence had become her closest companion. Only the steward gave them instructions, his voice practiced in indifference. Do not speak out of turn. Do not forget your place. Do not shame the Whitmore name further than it already stands. No blessing followed. None was expected, and so the sisters stepped into the rain. The carriage doors closed with a sound that felt too final for something so ordinary. Wheels turned. Gravel gave way to road, and the Whitmore estate, with all its bitterness and rot, receded into the mist like a memory trying to forget itself. Inside the carriage, silence settled between them. Eleanor sat straight-backed, her hands folded tightly in her lap beneath layers of fabric. Celeste leaned slightly toward the window, though there was nothing to see but blurred fields and broken hedgerows dissolving into distance. They did not speak. Words had always been dangerous in their home. In silence, at least, one could survive unnoticed. Hours passed like slow punishment. When the landscape began to shift, stone replacing soil, distant towers rising like iron spears against the sky, the sisters understood they were nearing Ashbourne Hall. Even before it came into full view, its presence was felt. The air itself seemed heavier, as though the land remembered every oath ever spoken upon it and refused to let them fade. Then it appeared. Ashbourne Hall rose from the mist like something carved rather than built, an ancient structure of cold grandeur, its windows dark and watchful. Chimneys exhaled smoke into the gray sky like restrained breath. Iron gates opened without welcome, only function. The carriage rolled inward. Servants lined the courtyard, their eyes flickering briefly toward the arriving guests before dropping again, disciplined by rumor. Whispered words passed through them like wind through dead branches. The Whitmore brides. They said they would be. Unfortunate. No one finished the sentence aloud. They did not need to. At the top of the stone steps stood the Ashbourne brothers. Duke Edmund Ashbourne did not move when the carriage stopped. He simply observed, as though time itself required permission to continue. His face held no anticipation, only preparation for disappointment. Beside him, Duke Alaric Ashbourne stood with arms loosely behind his back, gaze sharp enough to cut through distance. He was not looking at the carriage so much as through it, as if expecting deception to reveal itself before ceremony demanded trust. The doors opened. A hush spread through the courtyard. First came Eleanor, veil still lowered, white fabric hiding every feature, turning her into an idea rather than a person. She stepped down carefully, the hem of her dress brushing wet stone. There was no hesitation in her movement, only learned control. Then Celeste followed. The second sister moved with the same restraint, yet something about her posture betrayed quiet intelligence, as if she was constantly aware of everything she was not allowed to show. They stood side by side at the base of the steps, unseen faces turned toward the men who now owned their futures by law, not by affection. Edmund's eyes narrowed slightly, not in recognition, but in recalculation. The expectation of ugliness had been simple. Reality, however, rarely obeyed simplicity. Alaric did not speak, but something in his gaze shifted, subtle as a crack forming beneath ice. The contract was produced immediately, as if delay might allow truth to interfere. Ink, seal, signatures already prepared. Only vows remained. The Whitmore family representatives confirmed the final condition. The brides were to remain veiled until the ceremony was complete. Identity was irrelevant. Compliance was everything. And so Ashbourne Hall, in its ancient silence, prepared to bind four strangers under one irreversible promise. Above them, fog thickened against the sky, and somewhere within that quiet, unseen by anyone present, the first fracture between expectation and truth began to form. The storm had not broken, it had been waiting. Over Ashbourne Hall, the sky hung like a sheet of iron pressed too close to the earth, refusing mercy, refusing light. Rain fell in thin, patient lines, as though even the heavens had learned restraint in this place. The stones of the courtyard drank it without complaint, darkening into a deeper, older gray. Inside the hall, the air carried the weight of preparation. Candles being lit too quickly, doors opening and closing with controlled urgency. Servants, moving like shadows, taught never to linger in sight. For the Ashbourne brothers, there was no anticipation of joy, only the formal acceptance of what had already been decided. Duke Edmund stood near the tall windows of the entrance hall, his reflection fractured in rain-streaked glass. He did not watch the storm, he measured it, as if even weather could be assessed for weakness. His gloves remained on, his posture unchanged, his silence complete. Duke Alaric stood a few paces behind him, closer to the fire, but untouched by its warmth. He had not spoken since morning. He rarely spoke before truth had fully revealed itself. Words, in his belief, were for conclusions, not beginnings. Outside, carriage wheels cut through the gravel. The sound reached them like a signal. Servants straightened. Doors were checked. The hall itself seemed to hold its breath. "They've arrived," a steward murmured, though no one needed the announcement. Edmund turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the inevitability of it. Alaric did not move at all. The doors opened. Cold air entered first, wet, sharp, carrying the scent of iron rain and distant roads. Then came the carriage, stopping with a quiet finality that felt more like sentence than arrival. 2 footmen descended quickly. One stepped forward to open the door, his movements precise, rehearsed, devoid of ceremony. A pause followed. Not hesitation. Instruction. And then she appeared, veiled in white. The first bride stepped down carefully, her hand briefly touching the carriage frame for balance. The fabric over her face was thick enough to obscure all identity, falling in straight, deliberate lines. She did not look around. She did not search for comfort. She simply moved forward, as though she had already accepted every outcome waiting for her. Servants watched too long. Someone had expected hesitation, fear, perhaps even reluctance. But there was none of it, only stillness. Edmund's gaze sharpened, not in interest, but in reassessment. Rumor had painted a certain image. Reality refused to confirm it so easily. The second carriage door opened. The second bride emerged. She moved differently, not more boldly, not more timidly, simply aware, as if every sound in the courtyard was being recorded somewhere within her before it could be forgotten. Her veil, like the first, concealed all. Yet something in the way she held herself suggested education not permitted by the household that had sent her. A quiet discipline, a restraint that felt less like obedience and more like survival, refined into habit. Alaric's eyes narrowed slightly. Not recognition, observation. The sisters stood now side by side at the foot of the hall steps. White veils, dark rain, stone beneath them that had witnessed too many contracts signed without consent of the heart. Above them, the Ashbourne crest carved into iron watched silently, as it always had. The Whitmore escorts stepped forward, their presence brief and businesslike. No farewell was offered. None was required. The transfer had already been completed in full legal certainty. One of them spoke low, formally. The arrangements are as agreed. The brides are to remain veiled until the completion of the ceremony. No deviation, no exception. Edmund gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Alaric did not respond at all. The escorts departed without ceremony, their horses already restless in the rain, eager to leave behind whatever moral weight they had briefly carried. And just like that, the sisters were no longer under Whitmore protection. They were Ashbourne responsibility. Servants guided them inside. The hall swallowed them gently, as if it had done this many times before and had long stopped asking why. Inside, warmth replaced rain, but not comfort. Candles lined the walls, their light trembling against polished wood and ancestral portraits, whose eyes seemed too attentive for painted faces. The scent of wax and old stone lingered beneath the perfume of preparation. The brides were led to stand near the center of the hall, not seated, not welcomed, positioned, as if ceremony itself required them to be displayed before being acknowledged. Edmund stepped forward first. He stopped a measured distance away, studying the veiled figure before him. There was no softness in his expression, only calculation shaped by years of political marriages disguised as alliances. "You understand," he said quietly, voice controlled, "that this union is not built on familiarity." The first bride did not answer immediately. Then, softly, measured, careful. "I understand what is required." A pause. Not submissive, not fearful, controlled. Edmund's eyes lingered a fraction longer than necessary. Something about her tone did not match the narrative he had been given. Alaric moved next, approaching the second bride. He did not ask a question at first. He simply observed her stillness. Then, quietly, "And do you understand what is expected of you?" The second bride's head inclined slightly. Yes. One word. But it did not sound empty. It sounded contained, as if more words existed behind it, but had been locked away deliberately. Alaric did not look satisfied, but he also did not look convinced of disappointment. That alone was unusual. The hall remained silent except for the fire's soft crackle and the distant storm pressing against stone. A steward stepped forward with the contract. Heavy parchment, heavy ink, heavier consequences. "This evening," he announced, "the ceremonies shall proceed as arranged. The veils are to remain until vows are spoken." A tradition meant to preserve dignity or conceal deception. No one said which. Edmund turned slightly toward Alaric. A look passed between them, not spoken, but understood. Expectation had been set. But expectation, in Ashbourne history, had rarely survived contact with reality. The sisters remained still beneath their veils, unaware of how closely they were already being measured, not for beauty, not yet, but for something far more dangerous. Difference from what had been promised. Outside, thunder rolled once across the sky, like a distant judgment refusing to arrive. And within Ashbourne Hall, beneath its iron weight of stone and inheritance, for lives stood at the edge of an agreement that had already begun to fracture. Before a single vow had been spoken, the candles had burned lower by the time the hall settled into ceremony. Ashbourne Hall no longer felt like a residence. It had become something older in mood, an archive of inherited decisions, where every breath seemed borrowed from ancestors who had never learned forgiveness. Outside, the storm continued its slow, patient violence against stone and glass, but inside, silence had taken command. For lives stood at the center of it. 2 veiled women, 2 watching men, and a contract that did not care what any of them felt. The brides remained where they had been placed, neither seated nor free to move, only positioned beneath the weight of tradition. White fabric still concealed their faces completely, turning them into unknown shapes of promise and rumor. The Ashbourne brothers stood opposite them, framed by firelight and shadow. Duke Edmund's gaze remained steady, but not unmoved. He had expected simplicity, a transaction clean in its disappointment. Yet there was something unsettling in the absence of clarity. The unknown did not disturb him because it was beautiful or dangerous, but because it refused to behave like assumption. Duke Alaric, however, was no longer merely observing. He was listening, not to words spoken aloud, but to the silence between them. The ceremony began under the direction of a solemn priest, whose voice carried the practiced neutrality of men who had long stopped believing in the weight of vows. Under the authority of crown and lineage, he intoned, we proceed with the binding of 2 houses. The words drifted through the hall like smoke. The Whitmore escorts were gone. Their absence made the arrangement feel even more irreversible, as if responsibility had been quietly abandoned at the door. Then came the first deviation. A question was required by ritual, simple acknowledgement of consent before binding. Edmund turned toward the first bride. State your acceptance of this union. Silence followed. Not refusal, not hesitation, something more controlled. A breath passed beneath the veil. Then her voice emerged, soft, measured, carefully restrained. I accept. It should have ended there. But it did not sound like surrender. It sounded like calculation surviving confinement. Edmund's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Behind him, Alaric shifted his attention slightly, not toward the speaker, but toward the quality of silence that followed her words. The priest continued, and do you bind yourself to the house of Ashbourne in loyalty and lawful obedience? Again the pause. Longer this time. The first bride answered, I bind myself to what is lawful. Not obedience, not devotion, lawful, a careful choice, a boundary hidden in plain speech. Something in Edmund's expression tightened, not irritation, but recognition that something had been left unspoken on purpose. Alaric's gaze lowered slightly, as if replaying the phrasing internally. Lawful, not absolute, not unconditional. Controlled language from someone who understood the difference. The priest moved to the second bride. And do you accept this union without reservation? The second bride's head tilted faintly beneath the veil. Yes. One word again. But this time it carried weight. Not emotional weight, but structural. As if the answer had been shaped long before she stood in this hall, and she was merely retrieving it from memory. The priest hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, then continued, and do you bind yourself to loyalty and obedience to your husband? Silence. The fire crackled louder in the pause. Even the storm outside seemed to lean closer. Then her voice came, still soft, but no longer passive. I bind myself to truth that is not broken by command. A stillness fell across the hall that was not part of ritual. Even the servants along the walls felt it. Edmund turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge that something had shifted. Alaric did not move at all, but his attention sharpened in a way that made the air between him and the second bride feel narrower. The priest, visibly unsettled now, pressed forward. That is not the prescribed response. A moment of tension, small, but real. The second bride did not react immediately. Then, gently. Then perhaps the prescription was written for those who never intended truth to survive it. No raised voice. No defiance in volume. Only clarity. The words were not loud enough to disrupt ceremony, but they were precise enough to fracture it. Edmund's jaw tightened slightly. Alaric's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in interest that bordered on something more dangerous, a tension that could not be dismissed. The priest, sensing instability in ritual, attempted to proceed. The ceremony will continue. But the air had already changed, because ceremony depended on predictability, and predictability had begun to erode. Edmund stepped forward a fraction, not toward his bride, but toward control of the moment. "You will proceed as instructed," he said calmly, voice carrying the weight of command rather than emotion. The first bride turned her head slightly toward him, still veiled, still unknown, but aware. "I am proceeding," she replied quietly, "only not blindly." A pause. The word blindly hung in the air longer than it should have. Something in Edmund's expression shifted, not softening, but recalibrating. He had been expecting ignorance. What he was encountering, instead, was restraint shaped by awareness. Alaric spoke for the first time in the ceremony. His voice was quieter than Edmund's, but sharper in effect. "And what exactly do you believe you see?" The second bride turned slightly toward him. The movement was subtle, but deliberate. "I see," she said, "that veils are not always worn on faces." The hall seemed to tighten around those words. No one moved. Even the priest fell silent for a moment too long. Edmund exhaled once, controlled, as if resisting the instinct to respond too quickly. Alaric, however, did not resist. He studied her, not as a bride, not as a symbol, but as something that had not been correctly classified. A miscalculation in an otherwise controlled system. The Whitmore expectation, plain, forgettable, manageable, began to dissolve quietly in the background of his thoughts. Because forgettable people did not speak like that, and manageable people did not choose precision over submission in the first hour of their binding. The priest cleared his throat, attempting to restore structure. Let the ceremony proceed. The vows must be completed. Edmund did not look away from the veiled figure before him, but his voice, when it came, was lower now, measured differently. "Then we continue." The first bride gave no resistance. Neither did the second. But something had already changed in how they stood. Not posture, not position, understanding. The kind that cannot be reversed once it has been named internally. The vows were recited, words spoken by ritual rather than feeling. Yet beneath them, something else continued, silent, invisible, dangerous in its subtlety. A reassessment. Edmund began to notice it first in himself, the gap between what he had been told and what stood before him. Alaric noticed it in something else entirely, in the absence of fear. Not absence of emotion, absence of fear. As if neither bride believed they were truly powerless. As the final lines of ceremony approached, the hall no longer felt like it was moving toward completion. It felt like it was approaching exposure. And somewhere in that shifting silence, beneath veils that still refused to reveal truth, the first fracture between expectation and reality widened just enough to let uncertainty breathe. The final words of the ceremony did not arrive like celebration. They arrived like permission. Permission for something long restrained to finally end. Ashbourne Hall stood unnaturally still as the priest's voice reached its closing cadence, the last syllables dissolving into the vast, candlelit silence. Outside, the storm had not weakened. It had deepened, pressing against the windows as if trying to witness what the law would soon no longer conceal. For figures remained at the center of the hall. 2 brothers, 2 veiled brides, and a contract that now demanded completion. By law and witness, the priest declared, voice heavy with ritual fatigue. These unions are sealed. Let truth now be revealed. A pause followed, not ceremonial this time, but anticipatory. Even the servants along the walls seemed to lean inward without moving, because everyone knew what came next. The veils. The Whitmore condition had been absolute. No unveiling until vows were complete. Now the vows were complete. The condition had expired, and with it, so had protection. Duke Edmund did not move immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the woman before him, as if he could still extract clarity through fabric alone. There was no triumph in his expression, only resolution, cold, practiced, inevitable. Duke Alaric stood opposite his own bride, his attention no longer divided between ceremony and observation. Now there was only consequence. The priest stepped back. No further authority remained in him. Silence took over. Then Edmund spoke. Remove the veils. It was not a request. It was release. A servant hesitated for only a breath before stepping forward to the first bride. Carefully, almost reverently, gloved fingers lifted the white fabric that had hidden her face since departure. The cloth rose, slowly, as if the hall itself resisted what it would reveal. And then, her face was uncovered. A hush fell, so complete it felt like the world had stopped remembering how to breathe. Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood revealed. Not plain, not forgettable, not the rumor that had been sold across months of deliberate cruelty. Her beauty was not loud. It was restrained, shaped by hardship rather than indulgence. Pale light from the candles caught the subtle strength in her features, eyes that held endurance rather than softness, a gaze sharpened by years of being overlooked and underestimated. There was dignity in her stillness, but beneath it something quieter and more dangerous, refusal to be diminished again. For the first time, Edmund's expression changed. Not dramatically, but undeniably. A fraction of surprise broke through his control like light through frost. Because this was not what he had been told to expect. This was not what had been negotiated. Across the hall, Alaric's attention shifted instantly, not away, but deeper into understanding. The Whitmore lie had not been absence of beauty. It had been concealment of it. The servant moved to the second bride. The veil lifted, and the hall fractured again. Lady Celeste Whitmore stood revealed beneath it, different from her sister, yet equally striking in a way that did not ask for approval. Where Eleanor carried endurance, Celeste carried intelligence made visible, eyes that seemed to register everything at once, composed yet wounded by something deeper than circumstance. Her beauty was not ornamental. It was deliberate, as if survival itself had refined her into something unignorable. A second silence struck the hall, heavier than the first, because now the realization was no longer aesthetic. It was structural. Edmund's gaze moved between both women with a stillness that no longer belonged entirely to certainty. Alaric did not look away from Celeste at all, not because of attraction, because of recognition, not of who she was, but of what had been done. Whispers began somewhere at the edges of the hall. Servants who had been told to expect disappointment now struggled to reconcile rumor with reality. The word ugly echoed back through memory like a lie that suddenly had nowhere to hide. But the truth was not finished revealing itself yet, because Eleanor took a slow step forward, not away from Edmund, but toward the space between truth and accusation. Her voice, now unobstructed by veil or ritual, was quiet, but it carried. So this is what was promised. No question. Statement. Edmund's eyes narrowed slightly. You were not promised beauty or judgment. You were promised union. A faint shift in her expression, something between disbelief and restrained anger. And yet, she replied softly, you prepared for something else entirely. No one interrupted. Celeste's gaze moved subtly toward Alaric, not pleading, assessing. Then she spoke, voice steady despite the fracture in the air. Tell me, she said, what were you told we would be? The question did not land like curiosity. It landed like exposure. Alaric did not answer immediately, because answering required admitting something more dangerous than ignorance. It required acknowledging manipulation. Finally, he spoke. Less than what stands before me. A pause. Honest. Uncomfortable. Unfinished. Eleanor let out a quiet breath, not relief, not anger, but realization settling into place like a weight she had carried too long to notice. Celeste's expression tightened slightly. Then the story reached you as it reached us, she said, already arranged. Edmund's jaw clenched faintly at the implication, because now the fracture had widened beyond beauty. It had become intent. Someone had not merely misrepresented them. Someone had prepared them to be underestimated, to be controlled. The Whitmore family. The realization did not need to be spoken aloud for it to become present in the hall. Eleanor turned her head slightly toward her sister. A silent confirmation passed between them, something older than words, shaped in years of shared confinement. Then she looked back at Edmund. If we were meant to be lesser, she said quietly, why does it now feel like deception was never meant to protect you, but to limit us? The question did not accuse. It unsettled, because it suggested design, not mistake. Alaric took a slow step forward, not toward Celeste, but toward understanding. Then explain, he said quietly, why such effort would be made to diminish what is now visible. Celeste met his gaze fully, and for the first time her composure softened, not into weakness, but into something more human. Because, she said, men who expect ugliness do not guard themselves against intelligence hidden beneath it. Silence again. This time, it did not belong to ceremony. It belonged to consequence. Edmund looked at Eleanor longer now, not as a bride, but as a contradiction he had not been prepared to resolve. Alaric's attention remained on Celeste, but something in his expression had changed. Not admiration, not affection. Recognition of strategy. The realization settled across the hall like a final, irreversible shift. The Whitmores had not simply lied. They had switched expectation itself. And in doing so, they had ensured that the Ashbourne brothers would walk into their own unions, believing they were receiving less than they deserved. Instead, they had received something neither house had accounted for. Women who had survived being underestimated, and now stood revealed. The storm outside struck the windows again, louder this time, as if acknowledging the collapse of certainty within. For figures remained in the center of Ashbourne Hall. But nothing about their arrangement was what it had been an hour before. Not names, not expectations, not power, only truth, unveiled too late to remain harmless.